Eddie the Eagle Edwards, Olympic ski jumper extraordinaire, presents this slightly tongue-in-cheek video aimed at novice skiers. All members of the family will enjoy Eddie's unique brand of humour. He offers genuine help to any would-be skier. On the Piste is fun, but also gives good basic advice to those seriously thinking of donning their first pair of skis. Introducing a new concept in football videos, cigarette card heroes. Comedian and president of Aldershot Town FC, Arthur English, takes up the story.
Football today is full of pressures, coaching, money and systems. An individual player is almost a thing of the past. There was a time though when money wasn't king and comradeship was paramount and players lived for the game. That was the era when legends were born, names that are still revered in the hallowed halls of Arsenal, Newcastle, Everton, Sunderland. Some of those legends now relive those memories when they were yesterday's football's cigarette card heroes.
Footballing legend Len Shackleton recalls an amusing story about Stan Mortenson's experience when England lost 1-0 to America in the World Cup. With the aid of comic strips and archive footage, many other cigarette card heroes relate anecdotes from the past. An exceptional piece of footballing nostalgia.
Got any lemonade?
If you want.
Milk? Ugh! It's what Ian Rush drinks. Ian Rush? Yeah, and he said if I didn't drink lots of milk, when I grow up, I'm going to be good enough to play for Accrington Stanley. Accrington Stanley? Who are they? Exactly. Now get off. Give me some. Get off.
The Accrington Stanley Story, a film by Vincent Hayward. 113 years of football history. Founder members of the league in 1888, forced to resign in 1962. This is a film which charts the ups and downs of football in Accrington. Unique footage of the old days and the club as it is today, aiming for the conference and then back to the league. Legend, myth and reality, a rare chance to savour the history of one of football's most famous names, Accrington Stanley.
Won your town the race, we cheered you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high. Smart lad to slip betimes away from fields where glory does not stay, and early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose. So set before its echoes fade, the fleet put on the sill of shade, and hold to the low lintel up the still defended Challenge Cup.
It was a very sad, really sad day in the club's history, that.
Most of the clubs that have gone by the wayside have all been victims of mismanagement.
In March 1888, William McGregor of Aston Villa instigated the formation of the first Football League. It was finally decided that just 12 teams should compete in the league for the first season. Of these 12, only one has since fallen by the wayside, Accrington FC. Accrington were formed in 1878, and from then until 1894 they played their home matches at the Accrington Cricket Ground, a venue which is still used today by the Accrington Cricket Club. The club's first major trophy was the Lancashire Cup in 1881, and in the photograph that was taken at that time, 5 of the players, Talbot, Yates, Whittaker, Horne and Hartley, had been founder members. Although none of these men played in the first Football League match at Everton, one of the team that day was G. Howarth, who was to be capped for England on 5 occasions. One of the main entrances into the ground was off Cemetery Road, and the path which passes the cemetery on the right has probably changed little over the past 100 plus years. No doubt many of the record 10,000 crowd which was present at the cricket ground for the league match with near neighbours Blackburn Rovers in early 1893 also crossed this railway footbridge as they approached the ground. They would have entered at the south-east corner and made their way to the far end where the football pitch was marked out. In those days the ground was larger and encompassed the modern tennis courts area where a covered and seated stand was once located alongside the pitch touchline. The current pavilion is in the same position as the original structure. A few rows of seating still remain along the side opposite the pavilion. The club's opponents in the Football League days are now familiar names, but not so during the club's inaugural year. After 5 mediocre seasons, the club became one of the very few to resign from the league, and just 2 years later, they folded altogether. In 1891, the second club who were to be rejected from the Football League first put in an appearance. Darwin FC were formed in 1870, and 8 years later they nearly created a sensation in the Southern-dominated FA Cup. The club reached the quarter-finals, the furthest that any northern team had progressed to in the competition. However, a great deal of controversy was created, for their team included reputedly one of 2 of the first professional footballers in the world, the Scotsman Fergus Souter. Darwin faced the mighty and true blue amateurs, Old Etonians, at the Oval. A prominent member of this team was Lord Kinnaird, later president of the Football Association. With less than 10 minutes remaining, Darwin fought back from 1-5 down to draw the match 5-all, and it was only after a second replay that they finally succumbed to their famous opponents. The club played at Barley Bank from soon after their inception, and although forced to relocate in 1899, they moved and re-erected the seated stand at their new ground. It had previously stood on the southwest side of the Barley Bank cricket ground, and although barely 40 metres long, it provided the only covered accommodation for spectators. The club struggled for most of their 8 seasons in the Football League, and in 1899 they resigned rather than seek re-election. During this period, Barley Bank had been used for home matches, and today, despite the houses now on the site, the view from the hill above the town clearly shows the location of the former ground. (1892) saw the birth of the second division of the Football League, and amongst the influx of new clubs was Burton Swifts. In 1899, the Swifts combined with Burton Wanderers, who themselves had experienced 3 years of league football, to become Burton United. By 1891, the Swifts had moved to Peelcroft, and it had not much changed from a century or so ago. Along the east side was a narrow strip of terracing, and the banking of clinker and timber, although laid by the current occupants, the Rugby Club, just after the Second World War, is probably similar to the original. At the far end there was a covered standing enclosure.
Ted, when did football first start in the town, Ted? Well, it started first in 1871. We have proof of this by various records we've got. So therefore we claim that we are the oldest football association in the country, and in that case it must be the world. And we did celebrate our centenary in 1971.
The well-preserved stand, built of pitch pine, replaced an earlier one which was burnt down on Good Friday evening in 1907. Earlier in the day, the United, in their last season of league football, had entertained Leicester Foss. It was said that the crowd attracted to the fire was in excess of the numbers that normally attended the club's matches. The building just outside the ground was present a century or so ago, and the main entrance was, as now, at the southeast corner of Peel Croft.
Of course, the most prominent teams came the Burton Swifts, the Burton Wanderers and Burton United, who were in the second division of the Football League when it was founded. And we had second division football in Burton-on-Trent for 15 years.
Is there any risk of Peel Croft being pulled down, Ted?
There was a scare on a couple of years ago when some developers wanted to purchase this ground, and it caused quite a commotion, and if it had done, we should have been losing one of the most historic football grounds or sports grounds in the country if we had done. Yes, James Edis, who actually did the purchasing of this ground and also had this stand built after it was burnt down in 1907. There was a very independent brewery, and eventually, after the Second World War, they went in to the big Bass Wellington organisation, and so we lost another independent brewery in the town.
We are now on the balcony of the pavilion at the Hawthorne Road Cricket Ground, from 1884 the home of the original Bootle Football Club. This pavilion, although superficially changed over the years, can reasonably be titled the oldest football structure in the world. In the 1880s the ground was larger, and these houses overlay what was once the covered and seated stand that ran along one side of the football pitch. For some years Bootle fought for supremacy with neighbours Everton, when crowds of around 10,000 were fairly common. Bootle won the Liverpool and District Challenge Cup in 1889, although none of the line-up remained when the club made their debut in the Football League just 3 years later. It is difficult to imagine now that an estimated 20,000 fans were present for a match with Everton in December 1889. After just one mediocre season in the second division, Bootle resigned from the league and immediately folded, leaving Everton and the newly formed Liverpool Football Club to become the top two Merseyside clubs. The third of this trio of ex-league teams to put in a league appearance in 1892 was the Northwich Victoria Club.
Well, it started as a hare and hounds club whose members played both soccer and rugby. But in 1874 it was decided to concentrate solely on association football, and that's how Northwich Victoria came into being. The first match was at Commerbatch against Edmonds College, and that was a team composed of college players, where mainly soccer was played in those days at the universities. The Northwich second match, which is believed to be the first association match played in Manchester, was against the newly formed Manchester Association, Northwich winning 2-1.
The Vics now play at the drill field, but there was an earlier ground.
Oh yes, they started life on the ground known as Stumpers Field, which is close to where the Quick-Save supermarket is now down the road. But they moved to the drill field in 1875, the early part of the 1875-76 season. And that was the drill ground of the 3rd Battalion Cheshire Rifle Volunteers, and it had been their drill ground since the movement started in Northwich in the 1850s. And Northwich, of course, have been here ever since, making it the longest record for one team playing on the same ground.
The club were early members of the Football League for a short time.
Yes, they became founder members of the 2nd Division in 1892, but they only lasted 2 seasons because the cost of travelling was more than the club could afford, and at the end of the 2nd season they just didn't bother applying for re-election.
In those early years, I believe there were certain problems in the one corner of the pitch.
Yes, there was a ditch at one corner of the ground, and it was said that players like Billy Meredith used to take his corner kicks from a plank over the ditch. Well, C.J. Hughes was believed to be the founder of Northwich Victoria. He was an early player in the early days, and he became secretary and general factotum for the club, and as a result his services were rewarded with the presentation of this silver tea service. Well, this is a photograph of the Bridge Inn, which is just down the main road, and the landlord used to allow the team to change there in the early days of the club. And the interesting thing about the photograph is that on the gable end you can still see the poster advertising a Northwich Victoria versus Newcastle United match in 1893.
The unlikely named Middlesbrough Ionopolis made their brief league appearance in 1893, being formed 4 years earlier as a breakaway faction from the current Middlesbrough FC. The team was nicknamed the Washers, the title being derived as a result of them becoming a professional club from the start. It was stated that if you want professionals, you must put your washers together. Colloquially, for washers, read coins or money. Home matches were played at the romantic sounding Paradise Ground, which was located in the southern areas of the town. Although fairly small, the ground once held 14,000 spectators for an FA Cup match. Ironically, the current Ayresome Park overlays much of this former ground. Although quite successful during most of their 4 years' existence, it was soon found that the town could not support 2 professional teams. The Washers were moderately successful in the league when they played such clubs as Northwich Victoria and Burton Swifts, but at the end of the season they resigned and folded completely. In Loughborough, the amalgamation of the Athletic and Victoria clubs in 1886 produced the Loughborough Football Club, who were elected into the 2nd Division in 1895. The club played in black and white striped shirts both before their league career, this photograph was taken in 1889, and as seen in the later team group of 1897. The club only played in the 2nd Division for 5 dismal years before failing to gain re-election, their 3rd submission in 1900. A time capsule was revealed with this poster, which was discovered in the town behind a recently demolished wall. The main entrance to the ground, as now, was flanked by the Greyhound Public House, and this same passageway led through to a turnstile enclosure at the northwest corner of the athletic ground. The Loughs, as they were known, were well supported in their pre-league days and attracted a crowd of around 10,000 in 1893 for the visit of near neighbours Leicester Fosse for a Midland League fixture. Probably the most memorable victory on this site was the 8-0 thrashing of Arsenal, a result which to this day stands as the Gunners' record league defeat. Immediately behind the public house there was a building which served as the dressing rooms, and the ground covered this area which many years ago was developed for housing. We're now at the Northolm ground, the home of Gainsborough Trinity. Basically the ground has remained the same since the days when they were in the Football League. Obviously some of the facilities and features have changed. The stand is new, the far end used to be called the Gasworks end simply because there was a gasworks there. Gainsborough Trinity are a very old club. Could you give us some idea of the history?
They were founded in September 1873 as a local church side for a start. Then they progressed from there and went into the All Midland League. And after the All Midland League they went into the second division of the Football League in 1896 season. They stayed in the Football League until 1912 when they were put out of the league and superseded by Lincoln City. The first time Manchester United played as Manchester United, previously they were Newton Heath, and we had played Newton Heath in the second division, but when they changed the name from Newton Heath to Manchester United, the first game that Manchester United played was here on the Northolm in the second division, and they beat us 2-0.
Gainsborough started life as Trinity Recreation Society and for the first few years played at several different venues before settling at the Northolm around 1884, which they initially shared with the cricket club. Over the years, a number of players who started their careers at Gainsborough have gone on to greater things.
Actually, we had a good player who was very, very slim, and even though a lot of clubs looked at him, nobody would take him because they felt he was too timid or not well enough built for league football. And West Ham took this player, and a player called Jackie Morton played outside left. He did get an England cap at West Ham, and West Ham was so pleased with him, and they treated Gainsborough Trinity so well that there was this gentleman's agreement at that time. If we felt we had a good player, West Ham were always informed, and I wouldn't say they had first chance, but they always knew before anybody else knew that we thought we had a good player. But there's another interesting point about transfers. We did play Burnley in the FA Cup. This is in the time of the second division days. We did play Burnley in the FA Cup at Burnley, and Burnley was so impressed by our defence, Sewell, Gunton and Jones, that they bought the entire defence. Out of those three, Gunton and Jones became internationals. We also had a player by the name of Fred Spixley, or Spixley some people call him, who was transferred to Sheffield United, and I believe he still is the youngest international ever to play for England. We played Scunthorpe. At Scunthorpe, or Scunthorpe played here. The road between the two was alive with people. I mean, not many cars, but a few buses, plenty of bikes, and even people walking. In fact, when I was a young lad, I used to go on the bike, and I used to take two homing pigeons. And at half time, I used to write the score on a piece of paper, tie it around the pigeon's leg, let the pigeon come home. My father would be waiting at home, waiting for the pigeon to come to find out the score. And this was the interest in those days.
An illuminated address presented by the FA to Gainsborough Trinity in their centenary year. This year saw the inclusion of one of the strangest clubs to have played in the league. New Brighton Tower were formed just 1 year earlier, and their debut in the second division was, as can be seen from the programme, versus Gainsborough Trinity. The club were formed for purely commercial reasons by the New Brighton Tower Company in an attempt to provide a winter entertainment in this summer holiday resort. Due to the almost unlimited money made available to them, the club was able to assemble an exceptionally strong team. Jack Robinson was a current England international player with Derby County. Millward was an ex-international player and was enticed to leave Everton. John Goodall was also a former England player whilst with Preston and was signed from Derby County. The grand-sounding Welsh internationalist Smart Arridge came to New Brighton Tower. And so did Cunliffe, who later moved down south to Portsmouth. Sam Raybould was signed on. With others, the team soon became known as the Team of Internationals. The club's home was at the Tower Ground, a fine and enormous arena set within the Tower Pleasure Grounds. It was dominated by the tower itself, which was substantially demolished in the 1920s. Many years after the club's demise, the foundations of the tower remained, plus the ground, which was, amongst other sports, still used for football. New Brighton Tower were unsuccessful in their attempt to achieve First Division status, which they considered paramount, and this commercial failure led them into liquidation after only 3 reasonably successful playing seasons in the Football League. The year of 1898 also saw the inclusion of Glossop North End into the second division, who until 1952 played their home matches at the North Road Cricket Ground. The club were first formed in 1887, and this group photo was taken a year before their debut in the league. Sponsored by the wealthy Samuel Hill Wood, the club caused a sensation with this team when they were promoted to the first division at their first attempt. The pavilion in the background, although modernised, has survived to this day. In an exhibition cricket match at the North Road, the redoubtable W.G. Grace once appeared when he was allegedly bowled out with the first ball.
Out? What on earth do you mean, my dear fellow? These good people here have paid hard-earned money to see me bat, not to be bowled out first ball.
The football pitch was located in the southeast corner of the cricket field. At the far end, adjacent to North Road and alongside the railway, there were embankments. Raised open seating was provided at the other end, but as this encroached on the cricketers' area, it was removed each summer. There was also a permanent seated stand adjacent to the pavilion. Nearly a century ago, the players from such teams as Newcastle, Liverpool and Aston Villa would make this walk into these same dressing rooms that are still located under the pavilion. But for only one season, for the club were relegated after just 1 year with the elite and were finally rejected from the Football League in 1915. The first new club of the 20th century was destined to become the longest lived in the league of all the rejected clubs. For 62 years, clubs from the 2nd, 3rd and 4th divisions visited the Park Avenue ground of Bradford FC. No doubt thousands of ghosts replay their matches on what remains of the ground. Rugby had been played at Park Avenue long before Bradford's formation in 1907, and the architect Archibald Leach's vision of the ground varied greatly from the final design that can be seen from this aerial view that was taken many years later. Len, you were Bradford born. Who did you support, and did you play during the war?
Yes, I was Bradford born, but I played for Bradford Park Avenue, but the team that we supported as a family, and me as a kid, was Bradford City. The rivals, as it were, you know. The family didn't take too kindly when I signed for the opposition.
Did Bradford City make any approaches?
No, I got nothing from City. The manager at the time at Bradford Park Avenue, this we're talking about during the war, of course. The manager at Bradford was David Steele from Huddersfield. He played for Huddersfield, and he was very, very keen.
Imagine that these terraces once reverberated with the sights and sounds of Football League matches.
Kick-off in the second half, still no score. Caulfield, to Draper, Andrews, it's in. Draper's the scorer. Draper, number 8, finished it off. Bit of a scramble. Andrews just didn't control it properly when he got the pass. It stuck in the mouth a bit, and he couldn't take it with him, but they managed to scramble it in. And the score is Bradford 1, Doncaster 0 in the first 15 seconds of the second half.
We couldn't understand why we was always at the bottom, and when we did, we wasn't re-elected the last time because of the fact that our ground was one of the best in the league.
Despite the last few dismal years, from 1928 to 1950, Bradford was a second division club. Tim, you were, I believe, a supporter in the latter days of the club in the Football League.
Yes, I started following them probably about 1965. When we were a fairly successful club, we just come down from Division 3, so the only time I ever saw them playing in the Football League was in the 4th Division.
That's a goal kick. Well, the goalkeeper letting it go by and then rushing to take it quickly. I can't see the sense in that. Andrews. Goal. Oh, Draper. Well, he teed that over the bar. He won't get a better chance than that. He could have taken that in. Webber. Flores. Johnson. Lovejoy. Jeffrey. There it is, a goal, Webber. As we said earlier on, Webber looked our most dangerous player, but he had a sitter there close to him, right across the goal mouth. He took it very well, no messing about, slammed it in with his right foot. There's the score. Bradford 1, Doncaster 1.
Those same terraces that once listened to the joys and despairs of countless football fans are now but a crumbling reminder of days gone by. The weeds and trees that have grown between the cracks of the concrete now nearly obscure from view the remaining area of grass that was once the football pitch.
And well, I don't know why I left Bradford Park Avenue. I think Basically, it was bad management, I suppose, because I didn't particularly want to go, really. As I say, I don't really know why I went. The fact that they'd let me go was enough, well, you know, was sort of bad management, because if they'd have kept the site together, I think we could have got promotion quite easily that season, with the amount of young lads that David Steele had put together.
At that time, Bradford were in the second division.
In the second division, yes.
Can you recollect some of the players of those days?
Well, there was Jimmy Stephen was left back. He was captain of Scotland during the war. And there was Johnny Downey, who went to Man United. There was Billy Depledge, the outside right, was a good player. Billy Elliott, who played with me at Sunderland. Burnley, played for England, of course. There was Arthur Farrell, good left back from Huddersfield, there he came from. There was Chick Farr, the goalkeeper, George Stabb, Johnny McCall. There were some real good players. We had a real good side, a good blend of sort of youth and experience, which is what you need to be so successful.
Adjacent to the football ground is the cricket enclosure that has also been ravaged by time. It was honoured in the early 1950s by Her Majesty the Queen, when many thousands were present, many more than attended Bradford's football matches. There is a brief glimpse of the Doll's House, as it was known, that was shared by both football and cricket clubs. Also, a view of the ornate grandstand that seated summer fans on one side and on the other catered for the supporters of the winter sport.
Stephen Gibson, Huddersfield boy, young boy, about 18 or 19 years of age. Darfield, can he get it? Yes. Draper, Andrews. Offside. Five minutes to go. Tommy Singleton. Oh, it's a good one. Andrews the scorer. A really good on the turn, hit it on the fly. Glenn Andrews, out of the blue, the home team have gone ahead.
The team was successful that day, but in this, their penultimate season in the league, it was one of only 5 victories.
That's the story of football, isn't it? Most of the clubs that have gone by the wayside have all been victims of mismanagement.
In 1919, the last but one club to be elected direct into the second division was South Shields, but in just over a decade they were to become defunct. The team played at Horsley Hill Road, although by 1932 the stadium was no longer used for football and by then was being adapted to host greyhound racing. By the 1928-29 season, when this photograph was taken, South Shields had been relegated, and continually poor gates resulted in the team effectively disbanding just 2 years later. A photographer was on hand to capture the last South Shields goal at Horsley Hill, which was scored by Kennedy in the 2-2 draw with Accrington Stanley. A new club was founded a few miles away and took over from South Shields in 1930. There had been an earlier club in Gateshead, the virtual suburb of Newcastle upon Tyne, as seen in this 1913 team group. There's a gasometer on the horizon. Could there be a football ground nearby? Redhurst Park remained the home of Gateshead FC for over 30 years. By 1951 the team was still entrenched in the 3rd Division North, but prominent in their line-up at this time were the two Callender brothers at each end of the standing group, who together eventually amassed over 950 league appearances for the club. In 1952, Gateshead reached the 4th round of the FA Cup and 40,000 fans were attracted to their temporary home at St James's Park. 1 year later, extra training was necessary.
Gateshead in striped shirts come onto their home ground to try and make soccer history. The giants they're out to kill today are Bolton Wanderers. That's a tough proposition for any team, particularly for one from the 3rd Division. But the Gateshead lads are great fighters. Two Gateshead players challenge Bell, Bolton's left half, but he evades them both and passes. Cairns blocks it and clears upfield. Neither side has got one in the net by half-time. After resumption, Bolton pull up their socks and give a display we expect from a team of their class. Centre-half Barris clears and starts a movement. At the Gateshead goal, Moyer's shot is stopped, but a moment later, Lofthouse heads, and it's in the goal. Bolton are 1 up. Gateshead have yet to score.
The near 18,000 crowd were unable to urge their team through to the semi-finals. During the next 7 years, the club's fortunes slumped. An eventual rejection, unfairly in many people's eyes, from the league came in 1960. Gateshead continued in non-league football for a few more years, but the stadium by now was better known for its greyhound racing rather than for football. But even the canine sport floundered, and the virtually derelict arena was demolished in the early 1970s. By 1990, all vestiges of Redhurst Park disappeared, and the optimism that had been voiced for Gateshead in 1964 was not fulfilled.
I think if they got back in the Football League, and they got a decent team, they will get the gates.
The post-war period saw an initial new prosperity in Britain. With more money to spend, football enjoyed a boom period. There were many teams anxious to gain Football League status, notably from the south of England, and aided by ever-improving transport facilities, the wishes of many clubs were fulfilled with the formation of the 3rd Division in 1920. The entire Southern League formed the newly introduced 3rd Division, and Merthyr Town were one of 2 new clubs from Wales. Merthyr Town folded in 1934, but a new club, Merthyr Tydfil, came upon the scene 9 years later, playing at Penydarren, the home of their predecessors, which was formerly the site of an early Roman fort. The original club was founded in 1909, and by 1912 had risen to the 1st Division of the Southern League. But later successes were few and far between. This 1925 team group was taken a few months after the club's, on this occasion, successful re-election bid. For their away matches, the team from the Rhondda Valley had many long journeys to make, and some were undertaken in their modern team bus. The club were initially well supported, but unemployment in the coal mines took its toll. Crowds dwindled, results deteriorated further, and by January 1930, Merthyr were on their way out of the Football League. Today, the club can benefit from the changes in 1987 that were necessary at Penydarren for the staging of their European Cup Winners' Cup match. Back to the Vauxhall Conference in 1990, and Merthyr score against Colchester United. Nearby, in Aberdare, the Athletic followed in the footsteps of Merthyr when they became members of the renamed 3rd Division South. Aberdare Athletic had only been reformed 1 year earlier, but their forerunners were winning trophies back in the 1890s, and around the turn of the century provided 3 players, all named Jones, for the Welsh national team. Aberdare Athletics' first match was a Welsh League fixture on the 2nd of September 1920. Ynis Stadium was the club's home, but ground seekers should not be fooled by the stand which is currently used by the rugby club, as the former football enclosure was located a few hundred metres to the west. Barely any traces of Ynis Stadium remain today, but the church and the hills in the background help to pinpoint the site. Like Merthyr, Aberdare were initially well supported, and large crowds were accommodated on the raised open embankments and in the ornate seated stand. Enlargements to the latter were started but never completed. In 1924 the team was entertained at Westminster, but they were unable to put their own house in order, and 3 years later were rejected from the Football League. By this time crowds of around 20,000 for big matches had faded from memory. This year also saw the introduction of the regionalised 3rd Division North and a host of new Football League clubs. Several floundered, and probably the most famous was the charismatic Accrington Stanley. The club were not related to the earlier Accrington team, for they were formed in 1891, originally as Stanley Villa. The club's home matches in the league were played at Peel Park, and this was one of the main entrances which lay alongside the local primary school. All that is left now are the remains of the dressing rooms. In 1902, Stanley played at Moorhead Park, the last home of their predecessors. And the team was supported by the local newspaper, who paid for a nighttime advertising hot air balloon which was illuminated by electric lighting. There is very little left at Peel Park to identify it as a former football ground. This end, behind the goal, was once a high-terraced bank, and although minor games are still played here, the days of Football League matches ended in 1962, when for the first time ever, a league club resigned during a football season. Although Stanley started their league career with optimism, in the pre-war period, the top half of the division final placings were rare, although their first home match on September the 3rd attracted 11,500 enthusiastic supporters. Right, John, you were an Accrington Stanley supporter. When did you first start watching Stanley, and who were the personalities of the time?
1953 season. It was when they got Walter Galbraith as manager. And he brought a lot of Scottish players, as they do, and they started improving, because they're always the wooden spoonies of the 3rd Division North, weren't they? And then obviously when they got that very good side at 54-55, when they just missed out on promotion, I think they missed out to 3 years in a row, because only one went up then from the 3rd Division North, and they ended second, I think, twice, and third twice.
What sort of crowds came to Peel Park in those
days? At the beginning, they were, just before the revival, they used to call it the faithful 5,000, and then they built it up to, we were getting 10, 12,000 in some matches. They even used to, remember, they used to play friendly matches on Monday night against Scottish teams, because the manager being Scottish and all the teams Scottish, and they get 8,000 and 9,000 for friendly matches on Monday nights.
And of course they played the representative game, 3rd North versus 3rd South.
They played that up here just once, yes. Yeah, I mean, I came to that one, yeah.
And that was a full house, was it?
It wasn't full, no. No, the highest gate they had on was a friendly against Blackburn Rovers. It was just down the road, of course, you know. I think that was, well, it was 17,634 was the gate, and that's the highest gate they ever had on here.
The revival was short-lived, and financial problems became acute after the purchase of this former Aldershot military stand. Yet ironically, just 1 year before their resignation, Stanley, in the dark shirts, held 1st Division Preston North End to a 1-1 draw at Deepdale. In the replay at Peel Park, however, the third division team were easily beaten by 4 unopposed goals. The original stand on the Peel Park Hotel side of the ground still remained in the early 1960s, but this was burnt down in 1972 and the, by now, derelict remains of the ground were demolished soon after. Barrow, up in the northwest of the country, were another ambitious club who also gained their Football League baptism in 1921. But Holker Street crowds were rarely rewarded with success from their team, and the club survived no fewer than 10 re-election bids in their half-a-century membership of the league. The club's eventual rejection was perhaps inevitable, as the message was continually repeated. Did you first start watching them?
1937.
Well into the Football League days?
Oh yes, third division north actually.
That's right. I imagine you've seen a lot of players pass through, players that have gone on to greater things. Do you know, can you give us some of the names?
Well, there's been some brilliant players at Holker Street, of course, you know. There are not all that many have gone to bigger clubs. I mean, I suppose George Smith's the outstanding one. Went to Portsmouth at about 105,000 quid or something like that. And it would be in terms of this time money. But the better players we've had have come from other clubs to help Barrow, you know, in
their twilight, as it were.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
1967 was the club's most successful year when Barrow were promoted and had a brief stay in the third division. What about the games? You must have seen some very memorable games here in all those years.
Well, it's all relative. I mean, some of the games I've seen in non-league football are quite as good as the Football League games because you're more involved. But we have to think about FA Cup ties, haven't we? You know, Wolverhampton Wanderers and Leicester City and Southampton and Millwall and people like that. And then, of course, the Football League Cup, what used to be the old Football League Cup, Notts Forest, Crystal Palace and games like that, when this ground will be absolutely chock-a-block full.
And how many was that when it was chock-a-block?
Well, I think the highest grade somewhere over 17,000. But I mean, we would 14, 15, 16,000 was quite regular playing teams of that calibre. Yeah.
I presume the latter days, though, it was a sad sight with the numbers of crowds.
Well, I mean, the ultimate was when we got kicked out of the league in 72. I think everybody knows about that. And it was really a sad day. I suppose it was our own fault in some ways, you know. People didn't seem to realise just how desperate the situation was. And of course, when we got kicked out of the league, then we realised then it was desperate. And unfortunately, we made a bad start. We didn't get going for a year or two. And all in all, it was a disaster.
So generally, the supporters at that time felt that the club were going to get voted out of the league, did they? Or did it come as a surprise?
No, there were one or two people thought we got rejected a bit unfairly because it ran to a second vote, you know. And some people would say that there should not have been a second vote, that if Barrow weren't voted out in the first instance, that should have been it. But the other second vote, Hereford United got in. That was it.
The Cathedral City of Durham had a team who endured a short but miserable time in the league. Their career lasted for only 7 seasons, during most of which time they played at Holiday Park. This venue later became a Greyhound Stadium before disappearing in the mid-1960s. Durham has been long forgotten as a Football League club, and their only real notable contribution to the game was George Camsell, who started with the City before moving on to Middlesbrough, where he made 9 appearances for England. Like their contemporaries in South Wales, Durham suffered from the coal mining problems of the post-First World War period and were voted out of the league in 1928. The club changed their name in the early 1930s, but this did not change their fortunes. and they folded in 1938. Some miles nearer to the Scottish border and the most northerly team to play in the Football League, Ashington, who were formed in 1883, were another founder member of the 3rd Division North. From 1909, home matches were played at Portland Park, which is still the home of the club today. It is quite conceivable that this same turnstile block provided one of the entrances to the ground way back in the 1920s. Let us imagine that the date is the 12th of January 1924. After 2 unimpressive seasons, the team are now well placed in the table. But it's the first round of the Cup today, and we become part of the record attendance of 11,837. We await the appearance of the 2 teams from beneath the stand opposite us for this, the biggest game in Ashington's history. The black and white striped shirts of the homesters are the first to appear. As we watch from the packed terrace, the captains toss a coin. Ashington win and choose to kick towards the North Seaton Road end. Despite a plucky fight in which we score 1 goal, the railway end is under constant threat during the first half. Our dreams end with a final 1-5 defeat. Could these be the same goalposts from nearly 70 years ago? The terrace is now covered and provides more than enough protection for the scant crowds that currently come to Portland Park. There was to be no promotion at the end of the 1923-24 season, and in 1929 Ashington were to become another rejected club. Originally, the ground had embankments to all 4 sides, but with the introduction of greyhound racing, these have all but disappeared. The stand is fairly new and is located in the same position as the original one. Although the town has produced many famous footballers, including the Milburns and the Charltons, it was unable to support a Football League team for more than 8 seasons. The M65 motorway passes Accrington and leads on to Nelson. This road sign has a particular significance since it rises almost immediately above what was once the goalmouth at the east end of the football club's Seed Hill ground. Seed Hill has now disappeared, and vegetation and piles of rubbish cover the former pitch. The one remaining feature is the western boundary wall. Nelson were a moderately successful club, for after only 2 years in the 3rd Division North they were promoted to the 2nd Division, but this elevation was short-lived, for after only 1 season they were relegated back down into the lower reaches. The team group shot during the club's Football League days was taken in front of the pavilion. The club were not re-elected in 1931 after finishing bottom of the table. A start was made on dismantling the main stand in the late 1970s, and although for a time the football club were a reasonably successful non-league team, by now they had left Seed Hill and the ground had been used for other sporting pursuits. The rest of the ground was also demolished to make way for the new motorway. Now very much reduced in status, Nelson play at the modest Victoria Park ground, which is located just a few hundred metres from the Seed Hill site. A ground within one of the most picturesque settings of any that have graced the Football League is that at Bower Fold, still the home of Stalybridge Celtic. The Celtic were another founder member of the 3rd Division North, but chose to leave after only 2 quite successful seasons, during which time they finished 7th and 11th in the league table. The management at this time considered that the town was not large enough to support a Football League team, and the club, an almost unique decision, resigned. During these 2 years, there is one match which overshadowed all others, when, in the 1922-23 season, the Celtic entertained the high-flying First Division West Bromwich Albion in the FA Cup. After a scoreless draw at the Hawthorns, a record club match attendance of nearly 10,000 was present for the Bowerfold replay. One of those spectators recalls that day. I understand, Charlie,
Yes.
you've been a supporter of the club for a long time.
I have, yes.
And when did that start?
Well, actually, when I was 4-year-old, I came up here with my father, and I watched Celtic ever since. And even in the FA Cup in 1923, West Bromwich Albion, which I did not go to West Brom, but I came up here watching them on the Tuesday when we lost 2-0, and Sam Brute for Stalybridge missed the open goal in the first 5 minutes.
The Celtic assembled a strong and talented team, and their debut in the Football League resulted in a 6-0 home win over Chesterfield.
Yes, we've had some good players. Well, when we played West Brom, we had such a good player. The good centre forward was Sam Brute, but unfortunately he missed the open goal. He had off day for him. But Sam Brute was a good man. All the team celebrated that with West Brom. They played well.
And crowds, I imagine there were big crowds.
Well, we've
in
had
those.
good crowds, yes, every time. The biggest crowd up here were Dick Kerr's ladies, 14,000.
Who was the big man behind the club in those early days?
Herbert Rhodes.
And did you know much about him?
Well, I not to speak to you a very lot. I mean, like I said, they're all businessmen in them days, and they didn't bother with the working people a lot.
This was very much the directors of those days, presumably.
Yeah, they're all big people.
But he was a benefactor to the club,
Yes.
wasn't he?
He was. He built the ground.
And the ground, is it very much today? There are similarities today.
Well,
isn't
it's
there?
similar. It's similar to what it was in them days. With a new stand over there, but it were all done with woodwork, and they were good job.
The stand we're sitting in, is this the one during the Football
This
League
the
days?
one when they're in the league, yes.
Southport were known as Southport Central from their formation in 1888 until the First World War. They are the 7th club who entered the northern section of the 3rd Division in 1921, only to become later rejected. During nearly 60 years' membership, the club played at Hague Avenue, but the ground has been somewhat decimated during the last few years. The magnificent 2,000-seater stand, which was built in 1967 after fire had destroyed the original structure, now provides the only spectator cover at the ground today. In its heyday, Hague Avenue could accommodate 20,000 fans, of which 12,000 were undercover. But post-Bradford fire safety requirements have resulted in the removal of many features. An excellent view can be obtained from the stand, although rarely more than a few hundred are present now for home matches. More than on this occasion though, which was only a Sunday team's friendly challenge match. During their Football League career, Southport never rose above a final 4th position in the 3rd Division, and this team group of the 1970-71 season was taken 7 years before their eventual rejection. When Southport played their last home game in the Football League, they were about to seek re-election for the 3rd season in succession and the 10th in total. Destiny decreed that for their last league match, Southport were on the way out, whilst their opponents, Watford, were setting out on their climb to the 1st Division. Hague Avenue has seen many changes over the years, and more will be required should they ever regain their former status. They were the last of the clubs to be rejected when they slipped out of the league in 1978. This year saw the second town, the first was Accrington, to reintroduce the team into the Football League after the first efforts had ended in failure. New Brighton FC were known as the Rakers, named after their Sandhayes Park ground, which was situated off of Rakes Lane. The club had been formed only 2 years earlier and adopted a very professional approach from the outset when they became a limited company. Apart from their second campaign when they finished third in the table, the club generally struggled in the league. But there were several exciting FA Cup encounters. On the 14th of January 1928, the Rakers entertained the world-famous amateurs from London. There was a clash of colours, and while New Brighton, who were first to come out, retained their normal white shirts and blue shorts, the somewhat aloof Corinthians regaled in gold, white and mauve striped shirts. Watched by a crowd of over 9,000, including a particularly keen supporter, the captains tossed a coin and the Rakers chose to kick downhill in the first half. But good football was out of the question as the pitch was little more than a sea of mud. The amateurs took an early lead and dominated the first 45 minutes, but the homesters equalised on the stroke of half-time. Against the run of play, New Brighton added another goal in the second half to record a notable victory. This win took the club through to the fourth round where they lost at Port Vale, but this was a distinct improvement over the much-changed team's performance of a year earlier when they failed to progress past the first round. The Rakers continued to struggle in the league, and no doubt the fans' hopes of real success had, by 1937, become no more than a wishful dream. By now the team had changed their colours to red and white striped shirts and blue shorts, but it did not change their luck, and they finished the season in 15th place in the table. However, there was to be only another 2 years' football at Rakes Lane, for during the Second World War the ground was all but demolished by enemy bombing. From 1946 the Rakers were forced to make use of the dilapidated Tower Ground, the former home of their predecessors. Other sports had made use of the arena during the intervening half a century, but by now the large, neat ground of earlier times had deteriorated. The tower had been demolished in the 1920s, but the substantial base still dominated the northeast corner, and the raised cycle racing track was still present. The ground once again became the venue for Football League matches, and also for local cup finals, as can be seen in this film of 1949. But severely hampered by little money, low gates and a poorly maintained ground, the Rakers were voted out of the league in 1951. The last match before their eventual rejection was played on the 12th of May, but the match against the Irish team was hardly a cause for celebration. By 1977 little remained of the ground, and by now the club had already moved out. 6 years later, New Brighton FC folded completely. The last team before the Second World War to enter the Football League and later to become rejected joined the southern section of the Third Division. London was already well endowed with clubs, and this admittance of Thames Association was little short of lunacy. In an area which already contained a struggling league team, Clapton Orient, there was no justification for another. Thames had been created only 2 years earlier, and with a large playing staff which contained a mixture of old campaigners and fresh young blood, the club were ready for their first league match against Queen's Park Rangers on the 30th of August 1930. The team were easily beaten by 3-0, and by the season's end avoided re-election by just one place. The second and last season commenced with 2 home draws, but a lamentable season followed. The team finished bottom, support had dwindled to a few hundred, and there was no money left in the kitty. The club would probably have been elected out of the league, but at the last minute they withdrew their re-election application and folded. During their short life, the club played at the vast West Ham Stadium, but this venue with its Art Deco entrances was demolished in the early 1970s. The stadium was better known for its speedway meetings and once held 70,000 spectators. Thames record attendance was approximately 8,000. This year saw the last of the 26 rejected clubs to enter the Football League. Founded in 1884, the Reds first played on the Workington cricket field, adjacent to the turreted building in the middle of the picture. They moved on to Lonsdale Park, which still exists today, but by now in a thoroughly run-down condition. In 1909, the Reds' final resting place is immediately adjacent at Borough Park. In the Football League days, the ground had somewhat better facilities for spectators than today. The club shared Borough Park with the rugby club for a while, as the groundsman recalled some years ago.
We played the rugby league one week and the soccer played the following week, and I would imagine rugby league had average of 15,000 a game, and soccer at that time was about 9,000.
Did you ever get 2 games on the one day?
Yes, sir. We played Oldham Athletic in the afternoon. As soon as that game was finished, we let the crowd out, which was about 5,000, and within 20 minutes there was 21,000 in here, and we had the field all marked out for the rugby league.
Who in all the years that you've worked here is the outstanding personality?
Well, there's no doubt for me it's Bill Shankly.
Why do you say that?
Well, he had this enthusiasm for the game, and you had to work for him.
The ground has changed really very little since the club came out of the Football League. So in front of us here we had the stand. This is the covered stand, now a very sad looking structure. Fire regulations required that all the seating came down, and there is now just a corrugated roof over what are essentially the offices and dressing rooms below. At the far end it was a rather unusual covered enclosure. This started along one side, to the side of the stand, and continued round and behind the goal, pretty well as it is at the moment. At the far end of this enclosure, out of view of the camera, there were some entrances and quite a large flat area at the back. As we continue round, there is open terracing, all concreted, and we come round to what is a covered terrace, once again the same as in the league days. Extending about 2/3 the pitch length, this gave cover for quite a considerable number of people, still all concreted. The floodlights themselves are rather interesting because they were high towers at one time, but have now been truncated once again due to local authority requirements. The end behind the goal, where we are positioned at the moment, is quite a high concrete terrace, and once again had a covered terrace extending about half the pitch width and continuing round the corner to match up with the covered enclosure of the stand. Joan, you've been involved with the club for a number of years. Can you tell me what the feelings were when the club were elected into the Football League?
Well, at the time I was rather young, but I know my dad particularly, who was a fanatic of the club, was really delighted. And I'm sure the whole town was. We thought it was a marvellous achievement.
I imagine the crowds were very large in those days.
Much larger than they are now, yes. Yes, so large at times that my mum wouldn't let me come because she thought I'd get crushed.
Were there any particularly memorable players that played for the club?
Yes, we have quite a number that lots of people will have heard of. We have Ken Furphy. He went on to Watford from here. I think he's now helping the England manager. So is Keith Birkinshaw, who was the Spurs manager. George Aitken, I think he's also a backroom boy with the England manager. Dave Butler is the physio at Spurs. Lost a name, but a few. I'm sure we've got a lot more.
Now, there was one particular cup match that was very memorable.
Yes, the Manchester United one. A very, very exciting game. The whole town was really delighted about what was happening. Everybody flocked down to the ground. And the game itself, I think everyone who was here will remember it. Workington scored first, winning 1-0. Superb goal by Clive Colbridge. And apparently at half-time, Matt Busby was biting his cigar rather than smoking it because he was really worried. But I think experience told in the end, and it was the last sort of 15 minutes. And I think it was Dennis Violet scored a hat-trick. But some superb players on that day.
And there was a particularly poignant moment in that respect, wasn't there, as that cup game turned out?
Yes, that's right. The last FA Cup game that particular team played in England. And then the Munich air crash happened about a month later. A lot of those players were killed.
As time went on, of course, work